Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Pastoral Thoughts Podcast. This is your host, Jack Young, and today we have back once again Brother Brad Baker, and we're going to talk about reading. So I am very excited about this podcast. I know Brad is as well.
Yes, I'm very excited. Thank you for having me again, by the way, Jack.
And you know, I try to develop thankfulness, and so I try to be thankful for new things. You know, kind of like an exercise, morning prayer. I always go back to, Lord, thank you for books. And books are, why are books so amazing?
To me?
Yes.
Books are amazing because it's like, I grew up sort of antisocial. I had a hard time getting along with people growing up. And one of the things that books allowed me to have is a dialogue and an argument with somebody about a subject that I could choose and I was interested in. Yes. So like for me, and I was talking to Jim Caterly, who's one of the deacons here at Lighthouse, and I was talking to him about how, for me, when I'm sitting down with a book, it's actually a two-way conversation. Mm-hmm. And he was having a hard time relating to that because he's like, he just kind of.
So how do you have a two-way conversation with the author?
Well, so it's a very active process for me. So reading is not just reading the words and then letting them sink in it. You know, certainly it's not an exercise in memorization. Mm-hmm. But if I'm reading a book and I come across a claim, that's like a prompt. Mm-hmm. If you make a truth claim in a book, all right, now I want to check that out. I want to look, where did that come from? What is this author's perspective? Why would he make that claim? Especially if
somebody makes a statement. Let's say this: if someone makes a statement you don't agree with, are you highlight? Do you highlight or do you mark your books?
What's funny is I don't mark my books, but I like
books
to.
Are like too sacrilegious or something to mark books.
What's funny is that I don't mark my books, but I like to get used books that are already marked.
Okay.
I know you like to get nice shiny new books.
Well, I get books all the time from eBay. I do not mind if they've been highlighted. I really actually like it, and I like to if I see some underlines and marks off the side, I'll look forward to the end to see if they finished it. Mm-hmm. And so I like it if the person finished it and they're like highlighting as much in the end as they were in the beginning.
Sure.
That way I know they were like really into the book.
Right, yeah.
And so it's kind of like I am reading the author, and then I'm also reading with the person who is underlining stuff.
Yep, absolutely.
If I am a prolific highlighter.
Okay.
Some books, especially if I really like it, even on Kindle, I love the highlight option. Mm-hmm. And I'll export my highlights and print them off and keep them in a folder. But I like highlighting. And even if I don't agree, if I don't agree, especially if I strongly disagree, I'll like underline it. Mm-hmm. And probably I'll grab a pen and write something on the margin why.
Sure.
I'll write a question maybe.
Your objection to it?
Yes. Like, well, what about this?
Right.
So I am having a dialogue or an argument with the author when I'm reading it.
And so, very well, it's hard to pull somebody aside and it's like, hey, let's have this conversation about predestination and, Calvinism and the Reformation's impact on Protestantism, post, whatever, right?
Yeah.
It's hard for you to just...
How many individuals can you have that discussion with?
Exactly, unless somebody wrote a book on it.
Right.
And now I can go grab a book off the shelf, and it'll be like, history of Christianity post-Reformation. Okay, now we can have that conversation. Mm-hmm. What did it mean when this reformer said that?
Right.
What did that mean to the audience at the time? What was he trying to get at? Why was he bringing that question up? Mm-hmm. And how do I feel about it now?
Mm-hmm.
But
yes.
if I just grab somebody on a Wednesday night after prayer meeting, that conversation probably isn't going to go well.
No, and then people will say a lot about something they know nothing about.
Sure, right.
And so that's I just don't even have that conversation with that person because they don't even know what they're talking about.
Right. Yeah. In the best case, they might be placating your conversation out of respect to you, or just as a people pleasing sort of activity.
Or if they want to discuss something that went on during the Reformation, or there's backhanded statements about historical figures, like you don't know their times,
right,
or the conditions.
Yeah.
Or even it's funny because us Baptists, man, you would think that every Baptist that ever existed was a saint. and just stood for individual soul liberty. I always think about, how about all the slaveholders in the South that were Baptists? I mean, that's where Baptist denomination flourished.
We have
in the slaveholding South.
We have a fraught history with slavery. Yep.
Or like if Baptists take over community, there's religious liberty. Well, you should read about the King of Munster who ruled over 30,000 people, and it was a Baptist city.
I have a friend who lived in and I'm not, excuse me, I'm not picking on any particular flavor of Baptist, but it was a large convention of Baptists down in South Carolina. I can't imagine which one I'd be talking about.
And somewhere in the South there was a convention.
Yes, somewhere in the South there was a convention of Baptists, and it was one of those small towns in South Carolina, and everybody went to the same church. There were no secrets. The police officers were a member of the same church, so on and so forth. So that made it very difficult for you to live your life with what you were saying, your individual soul liberty. Like, what kind of freedom is there? And that's, like I said, like you're saying, it's not anything that's, it's not something that's just part of Presbyterian heritage. Right. It's not something that's just part of any given denomination or Christian heritage throughout history.
So if we wanted to think about those things, you can open up a book on the Reformation and read about what was going on politically surrounding that area and what the people had been enduring and how this character rose to prominence. Same with Baptist history. As well. I got a big section of Baptist history, and so I can pull out these books of people who've done their homework,
right?
And read in there, and then if they have a thin argument, like I can question that argument, and then also look at their sources. Where have they got their information from?
Right. So one thing that I found really interesting, particular to reading and Baptist history, as we all are, we tend to just presume that our cultural context and our history is the same for everyone else until as you get older.
Yeah.
And so
it's like Rush Limbaugh always used to say, people knew history back to the time that they were born.
Yeah.
And
whatever they were told about history before that.
Right.
So what I found really interesting, this is an argument and a really serious theological debate that was not only it was really big in Baptist circles in the 19th century and earliest 20th century. But it's something that we just accept axiomatically. But there was a big debate about whether or not churches should have Sunday schools.
Sure.
In the Baptist movements of the 19th century. And until 2 years ago, I didn't even know that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't even conceive. There's very few people that you could talk to anything about like that. I have one friend who I would trust his opinion on Baptist history, and that's Jim Alter, who that's his man. That's one of his he's genius.
Yeah.
But one of the areas he's well researched, well read, and also has produced a ton of curriculum on that. And you could talk about Sunday school all day long with him, the sources and the different movements that adopted it and how it got promoted. And
right. Yeah.
Who the opponents were to it.
And it changes your perspective because, like I said, up until 2 years ago, I was walking around just presuming that anyone everywhere has always just had a Sunday school program. Why wouldn't you have a Sunday school program?
Yeah.
So I wasn't even aware of why anybody would have that conversation.
So books give us a window into the past.
Yeah. And they tell you about what they give you perspective on your own experience.
Yes. And they're like counselors. So for instance, heard about a guy who said, and I wouldn't let no cigar sucking Spurgeon behind my pulpit. Again, go back to the time and the place. I would let Spurgeon smoke a cigar behind my pulpit. That's what I would do. But anyway, I mean, one of the greatest minds.
Sure. Has the bobblehead ever been on your podcast before?
Who?
Has the bobblehead ever been on your podcast?
Oh, you know what? I used to every once in a while get it out and set them here, but I do have a Spurgeon bobblehead.
Yeah, so if you're listening to this rather than watching it on YouTube,
Spurgeon's shaking his head up and down like that on the bobblehead.
I'm looking at Spurgeon right now. He's on Jack's bookshelf.
Are you looking at Spurgeon or is he looking at you?
You know what? He's staring a hole right through me, as a matter of fact.
That's exactly right. And so I can counsel with Spurgeon because he had all these many things put in print. Now he has more. His what's been printed of him is almost as much as an Encyclopedia Britannica, which doesn't mean much to people nowadays. But it's like just about 30 volumes of things produced by Spurgeon. And we can go back farther than that. I mean, we can go back thousands of years.
Yeah, we've got many dead mentors.
That's right.
It's interesting.
So I can keep some friends around.
Yeah.
Like Marcus Aurelius, you know, he's always nearby, and then so is Miyamoto Musashi, the samurai. And I think, you know, how cool is it that I can read a Roman emperor's self-help Stoic manual that he just wrote for himself, not for publication.
Right.
2,000 years after the fact. I mean, and it was the same book, you know, Meditations, that Thomas Jefferson had by his bedside.
Right.
And I can essentially have a conversation with a Roman emperor for 2,000 years ago.
Thomas Jefferson's another great example. We often have heard people who like to say things in the name of some of America's founding fathers, like, well, Thomas Jefferson would have never done it. If you want to know anything about Thomas Jefferson's theology or his worldview, I mean, I can go to my bookshelf and I can read what Thomas Jefferson thought about religion, Jesus of Nazareth, and Christianity just by reading the handmade gospel that he edited himself.
Right.
Where he just removed all the miracles
out of... He took the Bible and removed all the miracles out of the Bible and literally took like a pocket knife to the Bible and removed scripture.
Literally, yeah.
And then he thought that could be a nice manual for schools and things to teach the morality of Christ. And obviously the supernatural miracles, that didn't really happen.
Right. So when I hear or when I read or I discuss someone about with someone, you know, what the founding fathers really thought about the United States and its religious background, I'm like, I don't know. I've had a conversation with Thomas Jefferson. I'm not sure that he agrees with what you're saying about him right now.
All the time, you know, which is funny, I am rereading, and it's on my Kindle. What's his name? Macon, I think the last name, but it's Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power. And I can't think of the author's name. It's not Macon. It's not starts with an M.
Sure.
But anyway, reading it through the second time. But yeah, I mean, I think of Thomas Paine, who wrote the most popular article of the Revolution, Common Sense, and everybody had a copy of it or had read a copy of it, or if they were illiterate, had it read to them. And Thomas Paine was a well-renowned atheist. I mean, he was he was the Richard Dawkins of his day, and he really wrote the argument for why America should rebel.
Right.
So again, yeah, I know we had a great spiritual heritage. I know that there was founders that loved the Lord, but also at the same time, I know that there was other people on the ship, other people on board.
Right, yeah.
And so it is important for us to know this. And then also, if you have thinking people, like as a pastor, you have thinking people in the pew, and you get up on Sunday and preach about how that all of our founders were born again Baptist believers or whatever.
Right.
And you're really you're really going to hurt yourself, and you're really making statements that aren't true.
If there's somebody who has had those conversations with Thomas Jefferson through book reading and learning, those people are sitting in the pulpit, sitting in the pews.
Yes,
and they're listening to you say things that they know aren't true.
I'm thinking if he's going to make statements that are not true about that, what else is he making untrue statements about? He's creating his own facts up there, and of course, especially now in the day of fact checking and Alexa and everything else, you can find out who is full of baloney and who's not really quick.
Can I tell you a really quick anecdote about fact checking? So I'm hopelessly addicted to ChatGPT. I use it as a research tool. It's amazing. But my friend of mine, just as an exercise, a friend of mine, we both asked ChatGPT the same type of research question, and it gave us literally two different answers for the same question. It was a baseball question, so I won't get into it. But it was like what team started with the most wins in the beginning of the season? And it told me one team, and then told him the other. And the team that it told me actually lost the most games to begin a season, and it told him the other team that had won the most games. So
so be careful where you get your facts from.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, like you're saying, if you want to fact check somebody with Alexa or some sort of artificial intelligence system like that, you're not, unless you know what you're digging into in the first place, you can't necessarily trust. Like, for instance, I went to Jack and asked him a question about this. Well, does Jack know what he's talking about?
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like Jack may have an opinion, but an opinion is not exactly
That's right.
well informed all the time, right?
Yeah.
So when you had asked me about doing this and sitting down and revisiting our conversation about reading, it's funny that before we had started, you had hit record, we were talking about the idea of confirmation bias. And I was coming here with my illustration of how dangerous confirmation bias can be. And
so what is confirmation bias?
Confirmation bias is when you go looking for supporting evidence for the assumption that you've already made about a given topic. So I start with my conclusion, and now I go, and you can do this with Google. You can put a loaded question into Google that has your conclusion in it, and Google will answer it with articles
the conclusion that you want.
With exactly what you were looking for in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah. So if I were to Google, do evangelicals have as many divorces as the secular man?
Yeah.
She could come up with statistics that would say yes, because...
Or even better, why do evangelicals have a higher divorce rate than atheists, right?
There you go. And you're going to have some article that she's going to pull up for you that'll confirm your bias.
Absolutely. But this happens, I can say
Which
this.
is not... Klaus, it's not true. The way that they ask those questions is like, do you consider yourself a Christian?
Yeah.
And if they put yes, it like for people who actually attend church on a regular basis, and we're talking like 2 times a month. We're not even we're talking minimum effective dose. Those couples do stay together for far greater percentage.
Christmas and Easter is not good enough, is what you're saying?
Yeah.
I wasn't even
you
here
got to go
Easter.
once in the middle between Christmas and Easter, I think.
So confirmation bias, I can tell you, because however this may sting, I grew up in an IFB environment, and I can tell you, if you're listening to this and you're in an independent fundamental Baptist church, chances are, like, there's a higher chance than not that you are in a church that is probably not doing all that it could or should be doing in terms of your intellectual discipleship. Okay, and that can be very dangerous. And here's an example. I was taught in my discipleship environment, even before I was fully converted, really understood what salvation was, less than 12 years old. I was taught in my discipleship class on Wednesday night how to refute tulip. Probably 5 years before I learned who John Calvin was in world history.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So, and then later on, I visited a pastor who also grew up in that same discipleship environment. And he had a section about half the size of that shelf to my right here. And every single book was about how horrible John Calvin was or how the Calvinists are wrong. But no books from John Calvin or anything that John Calvin ever wrote, right? So that's where the confirmation bias is. If I'm looking for a book to refute John Calvin, that's great.
Yeah. And if you're going to be intellectually honest and you're truly not afraid of being converted, because I think some people, if they don't know what they believe very well, they have to stay away from the other side of the argument.
Yeah.
Like they have to be far removed from it. But if you're going to truly intellectually convince Calvinists of what they believe is wrong, what you need to do is go to the source, and you need to go to John Calvin for yourself. Read, Arthur Pink's Sovereignty of God and some other. You don't have to read that many. You can read 3 books.
Yeah.
Carefully, tediously, again, highlight, write your arguments to the side, and then you've gone to the source. But, if I have a Calvinist that I just want to prove them wrong in a debate, and I just read people who are just only going to confirm my side, they're going to build up a straw man of John Calvin, and they're going to beat the straw man to death.
Yeah, as soon as you walk up to somebody like R.C. Sproul and go after him about total depravity, you're done. Yeah, it's not going to work.
Yeah,
because he knows what he's talking about, and if you were like me, you just know that T stands for total depravity. You have that, and you know what somebody told you is wrong about that.
And in case you're wondering, Brett's not a Calvinist.
No, but
he's saying.
But the thing is I had to learn. First of all, I was taught to refute Calvinism before I even knew who John Calvin was. Then I found out who John Calvin was, and then I read John Calvin. And I realized that what I was being told about John Calvin was never correct. The conclusion
but to get you to not become a Calvinist, I have to conflate or inflate all of John Calvin's foibles.
Right. Yeah.
Where the people do the same thing to Martin Luther. And although, I don't condone all of Luther's behavior, he broke a third of the Holy Roman Empire away from the Pope. He translated the Bible into German, which the German people still use his translation to this day, propagated like the Word of God all throughout Germany, and really people could trace religious liberty. You say, well, he didn't provide, the guy was a man of his own time,
right?
But religious liberty could be traced back to, and then also freedom of the press can be traced back to Martin Luther.
Right.
So you better tell people that before you just say, all you're doing is going around and killing Baptists.
Well, and not only that, but then if you've been read, like you and I through Bible college, seminary work or whatever, we get exposed at least to some basic psychological principles. And you read what Martin Luther actually wrote about himself and his worldview, and you realize that you can have some empathy and sympathy for a guy that was clearly distressed mentally. He had some mental problems.
He definitely did. And he was the first to tell you that he did.
By the way, he had mental problems before there was medicine for mental problems. And so you're
and it's probably a good thing too, because the same thing with Charles Spurgeon, right, is that he had deep, dark depression at times.
Yeah.
And probably those guys in their dark moments were contrast this with this bright, shining brilliance, where if they would have been brought to the middle through drugs or whatever, they wouldn't have been as pronounced in society.
Yeah. Sometimes our greatest strengths are our greatest weaknesses.
Yeah.
But I always go back to that idea of, I was trained on how to quote unquote refute, finger quotes, Calvinism before I knew who John Calvin was. Right. And so that wasn't fair. The point is, though, not only was that not fair to John Calvin as a human being, let alone whether as a believer, just forget, we'll leave that alone. Just as a human being, that's not fair to do to anybody. But as a disciple and as somebody who is being brought to follow Jesus, that wasn't fair to me intellectually either, right? Because now I have this twisted, gnarled view of something that I'm supposed to, fight against and rail against, but I don't actually know what it is.
Yes.
And that's unhealthy, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I learned about that was it's not just what everyone tells you about that third party. You need to hear from them.
That third party.
And books are a great way to do that.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
I'm not going to...
Yeah, and we had a guy at our church, he wrote a book on apologetics, and he said the book that helped him write his book was 50 questions from a skeptic.
Yep.
And he said that I'm going to buy that book.
Yeah.
And I did buy that book. It's right back here. I haven't read it yet.
Yeah.
But he just took those arguments and meditated on them. And very popular, agnostic book.
Right.
And that's how he wrote his defense of the faith, was from questions from a skeptic.
A great example is one of the books that I like to hand out for somebody who has questions about the faith, is A Reason for God by Tim Keller.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. I'm the type of person where I'll read A Reason for God by Tim Keller, and then I'll read something like The God Delusion.
Dawkins,
by Dawkins.
Yeah. And again, someone's listening. That's not something I would recommend to, like, I'm not going to give Richard Dawkins The God Delusion to my 13 or 14-year-old daughter.
No,
it's not
going to work.
But someday, when she's sound in the faith and whatever, I think it's a good tool. And for instance, I know about Tim Keller, and a lot of people like paint him a certain way as well, and they don't know anything about him.
Right.
But I know who he was trained under, and I know the reason why he's has such a good apologetic is because when he started Redeemer in Manhattan, it was all white collar, highly educated, like 25 to 35-year-olds that he would have question and answer after the morning service, and he'd have all these skeptics and people who doubted the faith ask him tough questions. And of course, he's a highly educated, very well-read man. In fact, him and his wife both spent time at Ligonier studying there.
Right.
But they went to Gordon Conwell. They studied under Gershner and other people. I mean, they had a lot of common denominators. His wife actually. C.S. Lewis, one of the great apologetics of the faith, Mere Christianity. If you don't have that book, you should get it. Go on eBay.
It's another one to hand out.
$5.
Yep.
But his wife she became a pen pal of C.S. Lewis when she was in elementary school.
Yeah.
She edited the school paper, and she loved C.S. Lewis's book, Chronicles of Narnia, and she thought she didn't know anybody else who've ever read C.S. Lewis. So she was she just wrote C.S. Lewis about editing the paper and the difficulties she faced and yada, yada, yada. And this highly acclaimed Oxford educated scholar penned her back.
Yeah.
And they became pen pals in school. And of course, so Keller learns the C.S. Lewis apologetic by having this dialogue with Manhattan elites, highly educated. And then he writes The Reason for God, which becomes a New York Times bestseller. And, it is a great apologetic book to hand out.
And so
I'm saying he had to confront the opposing argument to become good at his argument.
And you have to be ready to be able to do that at some point. So if I had $1 for every time I have been told that an atheist is really just mad at God because something happened to them in their past, I would be a millionaire. And when you say that,
an angry atheist, yes,
yes, a lot of angry,
but just a regular old.
But no,
atheist.
I have friends that I interact with. Now, if I just go at them and say, "Well, you're just angry at God because you were hurt by a church," there is a percentage of time where that is not a true statement. So if that's all I got, because I've never really listened to what an atheist has to say, they're never going to listen to me.
No, and now that we have a secular culture, we have a generation of people like our age and younger who have never even been in a church.
Sure.
And they really think that any religion is like anti-science, anti-intellectual, and really if they want to get if they're educated or whatever, of course there's, God,
Right. Now imagine somebody who graduated from Bob Jones University. They grew up in church their whole life, and then at a certain point, they decide that atheism is they become intellectually convinced that atheism is their position. They know where you're coming from, but when you talk to them, you presume you know where they're coming from.
Right.
And how would that even be possible if A, you've never listened to them, and B, you've never become intellectually convinced that Christianity isn't the way to go?
Yeah.
So then you sit down and you try to have a conversation with that person, you're going to be insulting them the entire time. And I would say, how does that reflect well on Jesus?
Sure.
And
also the Spirit of God, come let us reason together.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so one of the reasons why you read is for desperation in defending the faith is because you want to know people, you want to know issues, you want to be able to have an answer for the hope that is within you, an answer in meekness and fear. You want to study to show yourself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word. So all these things are going to come about through reading.
Well, I know one of the things that's important to you, and confession time for me is like, this is actually a weakness on my part. I have, what's the word I'm looking for? My predisposition is to grab like just the most nitty gritty, hardcore, theological, like let's get into the Greek, let's break down the tenses, let's do all this, and let's just really dig in your heel. Man, I have some commentaries on my shelf that are literally word by word, not line by line, verse by verse. They're word by word,
paragraph, word, paragraph. Yeah,
yeah. So I love that, right? But I know that one of the things that's important to you is being widely read. So I would say that you as a pastor, and this is not a criticism, I know that you read more secular literature than I do.
You know what? I heard Warren Wiersbe speak one time, and for those who don't know who Warren Wiersbe is, like, where have you been? But Warren Wiersbe had a Through the Bible radio broadcast, and then also he was pastor of Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, and very, very famous pastor, great speaker. He wrote over 150 books, and he's got a great commentary series through the Bible. You can get it at ChristianBookDistributors.com for like $80 because they just print pallets and pallets of them. And that's why they're so cheap. And so my Warren Wiersbe is like beat to death. I almost don't even look at Wiersbe anymore because I almost know what he's going to say.
You just know it?
Yeah, kind of. I'm not quite there, but it's pretty close. But he said that 2/3 of everything that he read was secular.
Wow.
Because he said, I really want to understand how the lost mind works.
Yeah, sure.
But if you read his commentaries, man, he is going to make reference to all sorts of historical figures and literature and everything else. And if you heard him speak, he was fascinating at tying the scripture into life. It was unbelievable.
Right.
But that would have come from his wide reading. And he said 2/3 of all that he read was secular. Mine is not quite 2/3. I would say it would probably be half.
Yeah. And I would say mine is probably 10%, 10-90 is, so like, and that's for me because of my personality type. And this may resonate with some other people. Like I am just, man, I gotta go at whatever I'm passionate about or whatever it is.
Well, you only read one book at a time.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And I don't, for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
I will read broadly. I always have at least one biography going.
Mm-hmm.
To me, man, biographies are very therapeutic. Like, because you get out of your own problems and you realize that other people had just as many problems and more problems than you did.
Right.
And so I'll usually have a biography going at all times. Right now I got Thomas Jefferson. I might read 2 Thomas Jefferson books in a row. I did that last year. I did Ulysses S. Grant. I read a couple. Probably read like 1,500 pages on him, just to kind of get familiar with the guy, because I know a lot of people reference him, and for whatever reason, he's more popular now than he used to be. It used to be Robert E. Lee. Now it's like Ulysses S. Grant for some reason is the more popular Civil War character.
Yeah,
and then I'll have some sort of book that I'm working on, perhaps for a series. I'm preaching on the home right now, and I'm looking at probably like 10 or 12 books on the home that I grabbed out of my library and put them in that stack over there. I read one last week, and I should read one this week. And I'm doing a podcast with Jim Caterly on raising kids.
Sure.
Just like, I don't know exactly what we're going to do, but so I will read some book on
he's done a lot
raising
of that.
Kids. Yeah, he's got a lot of kids. Yeah, he's done twice as much as me.
Arguably, Sarah's still raising one.
Yeah.
Jim.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, she's got 7 kids.
So one of the things that I find about, see, for me, if I wanted to even split my reading, right, or even make it less, or make it more secular, right? The problem that I find myself is, maybe you can help somebody who might be in my shoes, is what if I don't want to read it? Like, how do you may find yourself.
I can answer that for everybody listening. You know, read what you love until you love to read.
Okay.
And I do this with my kids, and I say, because they're 2 of them are homeschooled, and I tell them, read at least a chapter of your Bible. They can read more, but they're going to read a chapter. And then you need to read for a half an hour. And they do Bible reading, and they have Bible class and stuff in their homeschool. But I'll just say, you have to read for half an hour. I don't care what. You just have to read. Because if they read what they love,
sure,
then stuff changes. Like Audriana right now, she's reading a lot of fiction. But I did at that age. I enjoyed fiction, and I think you can learn a lot about life. I know my 101-year-old grandmother, man, I don't know how many books she read a year, but it is all fiction, except for the Bible. She would read the Bible through 6 times a year, but I mean, she would read, like, she gets some author that writes mystery series, and she would, let's say, some lady wrote 50-some books. Grandma would read every single one of them.
Yeah, see, it's funny. I asked that because, like you're saying, I probably, if I were to self-assess, I would say I probably have a toxic aversion to fiction.
Okay.
I'm just like, a biography.
I'm not too big into it. I do see the value of it. And so I'd say, if somebody loves fiction, go ahead, and it'll help you with your imagination, and articulation. And also, and you'll learn a lot about human nature, I think, because in fiction, whoever the author has got to tell you about the emotions of the person and this, and and the dialogues between people, and you read some Jane Eyre thing, man, you got like two girls talking about a guy for like half the book. Like,
so when I was in school, I was the kid who wouldn't do any of the schoolwork, but I would sit at my desk, probably avoid. Oh man, I forgot to go to math class or whatever. Yeah, and I'd sit there with either my Thompson chain or a volume from the encyclopedia, or a thesaurus and a dictionary. This is what I was interested in. Yeah, so if you're like, oh, let's read some Mark Twain, I'd be like,
we'll see what helped you. And I realized that it in school, it wasn't that I was an idiot. I just didn't enjoy the things they were teaching me. So I was learning about other stuff. Right. But there were certain things like, for instance, history. I loved history class.
Sure.
But if I didn't see the use of something or the value of something, it was very hard for me to waste any mental space on it.
Right.
Because I wanted to be focused on something else. So that's why I think too, if you're reading a book and you hate it, unless it's for school, just toss it to the side and keep on picking up a book until you find one that you really, really like.
Right. And one thing that helps me if I'm reading maybe an author or I'm reading a point of view that I may not really feel positive about is what enables me to get through some of that information sometimes, especially in seminary, is well, this is a two-way conversation. The author doesn't know that, but I'm having a conversation with them. So,
now you definitely don't like a controlling atmosphere. So is education hard because you get all this assigned reading? Because it is for me.
It can be
like I'm in Old Testament theology right now. I've got 4 books over there that I've finished. I've got one over there that I haven't, and so I only have 2 left. So it'd been 5 Old Testament theology book.
Sure.
The one at home is like this thick.
Yeah, I know.
It is really good.
Yeah.
But it's something about I have to do it, and so since I have to read this book, it's tough to make myself do that. One of the things that I'm doing is, I don't know where I learned it, but I showed it to our staff here, is there's a thing called a tomato timer. And I've heard, 20 to 25 minutes is really how much mental focus you have at one spurt. And
sure.
like really, they say get up and water the plants or go for a walk, come back,
right.
and you're good for another 20 minutes. So I try to do a tomato timer of Old Testament theology reading a day. And I know I still have a couple months of reading in that class left.
Wow. Yeah. So it can be like that. I think it's just because most of the time the information that I'm going through, like in seminary, is something that I'm keenly interested in already. Is I don't normally have that problem. More so what I'm saying is, if I get a book, like for instance, I won't name the author because I'm not in the business of bashing anybody, but there was a prophecy eschatology book, and you just see the name of the author and you're like, oh, this is going to be a doozy,
Yeah.
And that's tough.
Yeah.
That's where it's just like, I've heard this. I know exactly why this is no good. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And those are struggles. Now, if it's a new piece of information that maybe I don't necessarily agree with, I can sort of interact with that. The hardest time is, when you just, I grew up with this particular point of view. I've already wrestled with this a lot, and I'm being made to revisit it, and I've already kind of moved on in my life, right. It's like, I don't want to do this. Yeah. Those ones are tough.
Yeah. And again, what I say about reading, because sometimes like, I like to read a lot of theology too, and a lot of books about the ministry and things like that. It is nice to change from, let's say, theology to reading a biography on Charles Wesley or
sure.
something like that.
Yeah.
Because now you're getting the inspiration part. Before it was like the meat, but now it's like kind of the cream puff or the inspiration. Somebody else is doing this, that, or the other.
Right.
So yeah, sometimes you get, or like you said, you're reading another book on prophecy. Come on, I already know what you believe on this and that.
Yeah, I know where you're going.
Okay. Watch this movie 1,000 times. I guess we'll watch it 1,001.
Right.
And so yeah, unless you're doing that for school, put that book down and pick up something else you like.
Just as a side note, the other difficult part is when you're doing that for school. Not only do you have to read the book and struggle through the book, and then there's like, here's the homework for that book, and you're like, oh man,
yeah,
because you're just like, oh, I don't want to. So
something that I've done, I was going to make mention of anyway. I was going to ask you here in a minute, like when you find time to read, or like what times a day do you read? But one of the things I was going to talk about anyway is that there's something called a commonplace book. You can Google that, or I call it a mastermind journal, and that's when I come across a phrase or
when it comes to a mastermind
or something. Now, here's why I call it mastermind journal, is because Benjamin Franklin and his group, is like the mastermind group. They would read books and talk about it.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking I'm writing down pearls of wisdom that I gleaned from some sort of a book or something like that for later. And I do every week of the world.
I was just
I'll
wondering,
read one page of a mastermind journal. And so I got this nice leather. It's a nice big leather one. What's that? 8.5 by 11. What is that the size? No,
it's about right.
I don't know. It's a big leather journal, and go ahead and buy the expensive one because you're going to be having it for a long time.
Yeah.
It could take you a long time to fill up that notebook. But I'll read 1 to 2 pages of that every single week. And man, I've got awesome, and it's not something that I wrote. It's something that I wrote down that somebody else put in a book or statement or fact or whatever.
That's what I was going to ask you, is whether or not you were qualified to write a mastermind book of any kind.
No. But it is to myself,
right.
and I guess this was something that was very common for hundreds of years, that people would have some sort of it's almost like a scrapbook of wisdom. So like pearls of wisdom, they're collecting from different places and putting it down into the common place. And a lot of times those would be coffee table books a long time ago, many moons ago. Yeah.
So what I have a similar idea, but I'm a kinesthetic learner. Right. So
what does that mean?
It means that I need
aesthetic. It means you have to move around.
Means that I need to physically work with the material. So that one of the reasons that I have.
That's why you like physical books too.
That's
right?
why I do like physical books, because there's a physical connection between the words on the page and myself.
Yeah.
But then there's this. I have this lump of data, which we call a book, right? Mm-hmm. And now I need to work with that information. And so what I do is. I remember way back in 1996, I thought I was going to be a website developer because this was this hot new thing called the internet out, right?
Yeah.
And so I learned a very rudimentary amount of HTML. And so my sort of like catch-all anthology of notes and quotations and commentary snippets and stuff is all done with like old school gray background, black text HTML. Because I need to be able to work with that. If I can't work with that information, it'll just rot in my head. And so that's what helps me assimilate what I've put together. And in the same way,
there's something good about getting it, capturing that thought and putting it someplace.
Right. And when I was a kid,
like a collection. So everybody needs a collection bucket. What that is might look different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing too is find a way to connect that information that you're reading about to your everyday life. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's like an activity. I remember in my Christian school growing up, we had to memorize a series of Bible verses for like each quarter. Mm-hmm. And for me, rote memorization isn't my ideal. But what helped me with memorizing those verses was just the physical act of writing it on a 3x5 card. I hardly ever referred to the 3x5 card because by the time I was done writing out my 3x5 cards, I generally memorize the verses.
Yeah. There's an author that I read. I get his books, but when they come out. But his name's Ryan Holiday, and he's a big reader. Mm-hmm. And one of the things, I can't remember what he calls his collection bucket, but he writes everything out in 4x6 cards. But when you write something out, it's like saying it 7 times.
Sure.
And so the physical act of writing. And I was watching a panel again. I won't name the pastors around, of a premier preachers in the United States of America. Every single one of them.
Were they at a convention in the South?
This one they actually weren't. I'll give you insight. They were at the Shepherds Conference at John MacArthur. So he had a bunch of, it was like Al Mohler, Alistair Begg, some other big ones all the way around.
Yeah.
Every single one of those guys says, I know how to use a computer every single day of my life. Mm-hmm. But when it came to their sermons, they physically wrote out their sermon. Mm-hmm. And Mahler was saying, now he's like a huge egghead. He's like one of the premier scholars of the Southern Baptist Convention. Mm-hmm. I can't remember what seminary he presides over, president of Southern Seminary or something like that. But he said, there's that connection, that physical connection. This is especially important for males, is that they take dominance over whatever material.
Work with the
kinesiology, movement. And so, when you write out the material, there's that body connection to that information there too. Mm-hmm. So I do like physically writing that stuff out. That's like why I like writing down in the mastermind journal. I usually keep these binders around my house and stuff, and I'll just write stuff on there
that
I come across that doesn't belong in my mastermind journal, and it really doesn't belong in my day planner, but it's just a thought or something. I get that down into paper. You can export your Kindle highlights, print them off. I like to do that, punch holes in them, and I'll file them. I've got files. Another thing that you can do, instead of writing, if you want to speed up the process, is voice to text is getting really, really good.
Yeah, generally speaking, yeah.
So
unless you're my boss for some reason.
Okay.
He seems to be particularly bad at voice to text.
You're going to have to teach him, get him better software or something like that. You can. So I will voice to text right into a Word document, and at the top it'll say the book, and voice to text the highlights, and then print them off.
Yeah.
And I think the more that you use a material, the more integrated it will be into your life, and that's why, like, I want to read about the home. I want to read about the family. I want to be a better father, a better husband, all these things. But since we're doing a series at church on this, I can take in a voluminous
There you go.
amount of information.
Yep.
And then also you take notes, but then also process that information to teach others with. And so you can see how it's that repetition of that knowledge.
Yeah, I think that as we're talking about books and reading and how that integrates, integration is really important because sometimes the act of reading seems to be or can be portrayed as like sort of fruitless, like, oh, you're just filling up your head with a bunch of words. And I would, and that's kind of an unfair stereotype for some people. However, there is a danger in that, right?
You only got so much space in your brain, then you'll die.
If you don't do anything with this information,
right.
And that's actually kind of why sometimes I find I kind of go, what is the utility in me reading this fiction or whatever?
Yeah.
Because it's like, okay, now I've read, let's just say, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, which is a piece of fiction I do love.
Yeah.
But what do I do with that? Like, I can't tell you that I know, other than I'm familiar with the cultural impact of Mark Twain.
What's the utility of it?
Yeah.
I do every once in a while. I go out of the way. And I just thought recently I need to go back and read all of the Lord of the Rings series. Even though I generally wouldn't do something like that, but I was reading about different people who were people I would look up to that really admire the writings of J.R. Tolkien.
Right.
And then there's so many references to that. But I would say if you're reading literature or if you're reading fiction, you are developing your imagination, and then also it is a piece of artwork, and you can see how all the different characters and the plays kind of roll into one. That could help you with other things as far as different endeavors, like if you're a public speaker or in communication or what have you.
You don't want to be intellectually disconnected from the culture that you're trying to communicate with.
But you sit down, and I'm the same way. I don't read that very much fiction.
Right.
And I don't want to completely dismiss it because some people will watch this and they love fiction. I'm not saying there's anything bad with it, but I'm like, man, what is the utility? Like, where are we going with this? I can't use this information.
Well, it's funny because as you study theology, you find out how important understanding the literary genre of the biblical material you're trying to read. So if you come across Second Temple apocalyptic literature in the Bible, you kind of need to understand that genre in order for you to actually study. So, but that genre, that extra biblical genre is largely fiction, right? So you need to learn how to interact with the type of literature before you can even come back to the Bible and go, okay, so what is being communicated? What is being divinely communicated with this genre? If I'm completely unfamiliar with it, I'm going to come up with all kinds of crazy ideas.
Yes. And so, rule of interpreting scripture is historical, literal, grammatical. Who is it written to, and what did it mean to them? Meaning, what was going on during that time period? And exactly. If you're reading Ezra and Nehemiah, you got to understand what are these people going through? What's going on here?
Right. And you need to understand when a prophet starts speaking in prophetic language, how that's supposed to work. What forms are they using? It was funny. I was in a Sunday school this past week, and the person teaching was noticing the similarity between verse 1 and verse 3 of a particular psalm. and I'm not ripping on the person, but they didn't realize that this was Hebrew chiastic parallelism, which is theologically significant. And he was hampered in his ability to teach what he was trying to get across in his class because he was unfamiliar with how Hebrew poetry as a genre is supposed to work. And so, and that's where I have to check myself and go, okay, like I may not want to, like you said, interact with the Lord of the Rings. It sounds miserable to me. Yeah. However, people, even really good theologians, use and were influenced by the way they learn to read literature through that type of writing. And so that's where you, in order to get the historical context of, say, a C.S. Lewis, I'm going to need to be familiar with the Lord of the Rings as much as I may dread it.
Right. Yeah. So there is value, and you should understand the value when you sit down. Like, why am I reading this book? What it's going to come of it? So what are some times that you read? Like, obviously, you put a lot of time into reading.
Yeah,
like,
I probably.
How does that come about? How does that happen?
So I am much like my father. I'm a very much a free spirit. Structure can sometimes be a barrier or an obstacle for me. However, I am almost always in a book on the way to bed, either in bed or on the way to bed. That's where I'm in a book. Not real big.
I don't think I can't remember the last time I went to sleep without reading. Yeah.
I'm not a real big morning reading person. I kind of like need to get my engine running for a little while and just sort of be in a flow state, and then I'm ready to it. Because again, me, if I were to read but without being engaged intellectually with the material in an active way, I might as well have just wasted my time. So for me personally, waking up in the morning and sort of getting my bearings, like, oh, let me do my reading time, that doesn't work for me. However, usually what I'll do is I'll grab a lunch, make sure that my work, my professional work and my school work is out of the way, or at least I have a plan for it. Have my lunch, and I was like, okay, I'm going to be dealing with this text over this amount of time. Usually I set a boundary to it.
Okay.
Usually an hour or two.
Okay.
And then I'll leave it alone. But then the rest of the day, that material that I was reading for an hour or two, I'm just chewing on it. And because I send you a litany of text messages.
One of the ways that Brad thinks and processes what he's reading is that he'll send me, and probably a bunch of other people too, like a paragraph about a particular something that he's like, oh, Brad's reading about this.
Yep.
And it helps him. Even if nobody else reads the text,
nope.
At least it helps you think it through and communicate it to somebody, so you're having that dialogue.
But it also plants a seed for maybe now I can pull you aside on Wednesday night and say, hey, that thing I brought up the other day? Because again, my only other option has been interacting with that author in those pages.
Right.
But if you're reading something more passive, I'm sure it helps. It's helpful to wake up. I know a lot of people like to get up and do their morning Bible reading.
I do that.
Yeah.
And so I am more structured, as far as my schedule and everything. At church, I really don't do hardly any outside reading. Now, I will study for things coming up, different sermons and things, but I did get a lot of studying and a lot of reading done at home. And once I get my Bible reading done in the morning, I'll read. Mondays, I'm usually at home, and I'll take extra time to read on Mondays. And then when I get home and I have dinner, I have dinner tonight, and I think the kids will be going off to swim, and they're in swim team, all three of them. And so when they go off to swim, I'm going straight into the sunroom, and that is my place. And so I have my books and my work in there, and I do have a book set aside for tonight, and I'm hoping to finish that tonight. And so I will be in the sunroom for at least 2 hours solid, and I'll get it'll be serious time in there.
You and I are similar there because the environment that we read in is very important. So for me, that's my office.
Yeah.
It's very difficult for me to bring home a book that I'm working through, either for school or personal study or what have you, and just sort of chill on the couch and read it.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work. For me, being in a silent office surrounded by other books, because if I have an inkling or I have a prompt to look into something deeper, I know that everything's at an arm's length.
Yes.
It almost feels safe
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
you know, I read.
You're surrounded by your friends.
Yeah,
Your books. Yeah,
exactly.
And you
like,
can counsel with them at any time.
right. He's like, well, hold on. Or you can help. It can help you. It helps me assimilate the information. I've heard that similarly somewhere else. You know,
Right.
And then you go and you find your whatever
Yeah.
from. So you grab your Matthew Henry and you're like, oh, that's where I heard that from.
Yeah.
And so for me, the environment, like a controlled environment, is really now.
Me too. I think you your environment is so important, and this is from stuff that I have read. But yeah, you're going to set yourself up for success. And so, where's your reading room at? Don't have like a screen in front of your face.
Yeah.
Don't have like, you know, I like having. I watch TV.
Mm-hmm.
But my TV, you know, fortunately we've had houses set up this way. Our TV is in the TV room. It's not, there's no screen in the living room, and there's no screen in my sunroom. And that's where my sunroom is, where I hang out and read. But I'm there, big stack of study Bibles. I usually have about 20, 25 books in there. And, you know, and I'm just there going to town. I got my notepads, I got my pens, and, you know, I'm ready to do some damage. And another thing that helps me, for folks out there, is 8 o'clock is when I call it quits, or I have given permission to myself to stop working at 8 p.m. Sometimes I'll go past that, but that's just because I'm having fun.
Right. Yeah.
But 8, I'm done. Watch a little trashy TV, and then I'll go to bed. We usually go to bed a little after 9, but then I'm reading on my Kindle at night because my wife will not.
If you're watching this on YouTube, if you ever see Jack after 9 p.m., his face is totally different. He's done. He's like, just out.
I'm out of here. I don't care what's going on.
It's almost disconcerting.
Yeah.
But I think if I were to give my biggest practical advice when it comes to reading, studying, interacting with literature, is self-awareness. Right. So we talked about cognitive bias. We talked about setting. We talked about paying attention to not only who you read, but also who they read.
Oh, and I tell you what, here's a tip. I'm reading a biography right now, and you know, it'll say different books that like you know, you're reading about a great pastor of yesteryear, and he had a book that changed his life. Well, right now you can you pull out your phone, go on eBay, and get that same book for $10.
Yeah.
You better mark it down. I'm going to own that book. And so, man, we live in the, you know, in some sense, the best of times.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like it's like the Renaissance for people who want information. You can order a book. I can't remember the book that I sent you the other day, and I said, I bet you don't have this. It was something about the doctrines of evangelicalism, and that shaped America or whatever, and it has like Moody and Spurgeon and Finney and like all these different, you know, and I was reading, and someone said that book revolutionized their life in the book. So I'm like, boom, I'm gonna order that book.
Yep. That self-awareness though goes to, if you know, because like as a contrast to the way you and I are. I know I have some friends who are like those weird readers who, they don't need a book. They're okay with like one of those e-paper things, and they'll sit in the middle of a Super Bowl party with their e-reader, and they'll just be.
That's impressive.
You know.
Yeah.
That person, I guarantee they're completely fine. So none of what I have to say or what Jack has to say constitutes.
For everybody.
A hard and fast rule, but it's all stuff that we've learned along the way that may enable you or may resonate with you.
Another thing that you need to do, and I was just reading a fellow by the name of Thomas Kidd. He's a professor down at Baylor University. He wrote a book on Thomas Jefferson. He wrote a book on Baptist history. He's written a lot of other books, very prolific, on the founders and things like that. And I've seen this with other people too, but he said everywhere he goes, he always has a book with him just in case he's getting his oil changed.
Yeah.
And he's sitting there reading a book. He's in the doctor's office. He's going to be reading a book. And I do try to utilize that. I mean, if I know that I'm going to have to go somewhere and wait, I am going to bring a book with me. Like if I've taken the kids to swim and I'm going to be in the bleachers for an hour. well, I'm going to have the noise canceling headphones on and I'm going to have a book and I'll just be up there working away, reading a book.
Yeah.
And so you have to be mindful of different things, redeeming the time.
Yeah, and we talked about this last time, but another thing that I like to do is, say I'm reading a book, say I'm reading that book on prophecy. I might be supplementing that book rather than carrying that book around for that free time. In my particular case, what I might do is I might use that free time to interact with other material around that same subject. Like I might be listening to some sermons with that,
right.
with those same headphones on that you're talking about. And rather than reading that book, I might be working through the material with someone else's voice in my head.
Right.
And getting a different perspective along the way. And then the other, that self-awareness thing, we all bring our presuppositions and confirmation bias is a real danger if you're trying to actually learn. If you're not interested in learning, then fine, go ahead and have fun with your confirmation bias.
Right.
But if you're actually interested in being intellectually honest, one of my best practices is to take the book that you're working on, have that two-way conversation with that author as best you can, and then find the polar opposite of that author on almost exactly the same thing and read them all the way through.
Yeah, absolutely.
See how those ideas interact, and then you can sort of work them through. 95% of the time, you're not going to change your stance.
No.
And that's okay. But it's important that even if you agree with the first author, that you understand that if
you'll be so much stronger in your position.
Absolutely.
When you read the opposing argument, because now you know the real talking points and you know the real issue. And also, if you're going to be trying to persuade somebody, instead of hollering and making backhanded statements, you can actually reason with the person because you have come to see their perspective. And here's why you disagree with it.
Yeah. And so there's two quotes. One's from R.C. Sproul, and the other one is from, I heard from a prominent theologian, but I don't think it's his quote, so I won't quote him. R.C. Sproul said that he was warned when he was going to seminary that he was going to be exposed to all this liberal theology, and it's going to corrupt him, right? And he would say that you cannot be aware of something if you aren't aware of something. So again, I read books by progressive Christians. I sent you an email amongst other people. It was a theological position written by a liberal progressive Christian on a very socially inflammatory subject. Not because I agreed with him, but because it's important to understand that when you talk to somebody, it could be very well possible that they have a sincere conviction or they're convinced of something sincerely. And so it's not fair for us with our high and mighty positions to walk in and just want to chop off their head.
Right.
And then the other quote was, all truth is God's truth. And I'm almost positive that's like an old quote.
Forever,
right?
yeah.
So let's say I read a book and then I read that opposing view, and after page 50, I'm kind of like, wait a minute, I think this opposing view is probably more credible and coherent. That's okay. Because if it is truth, it comes from the author of truth.
Yes, and you have to learn, you have to humble yourself and realize that you do not know everything. So I gotta mention audiobooks because you and I both love audiobooks, and they're a wonderful thing. If you got to commute in your car, you're driving or mowing the lawn or whatever, you can listen to audiobooks. I highly recommend them. Then one thing that Brad really got me into, and that is immersive reading. And that's where you read a book and you listen to it at the same time. And I love doing that. I mean, it is like reading on steroids. It's like cheating.
I remember a couple
it's like
weeks
a cheat code. It's really awesome.
A couple weeks we'd be like, I'm listening to 2X, and I'm like, oh, that's cute, Jay.
And welcome
Audible
to
Audible actually doesn't go fast enough for me at this point.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, it is funny. You'll be first you put it up to 2-speed. I think, man, I'm reading it really fast.
It's a lot like cardio.
But then after a while, you're like, this is too slow.
Yeah.
And yeah, you'll jack that thing up. It's kind of like a treadmill. Yeah.
The first time you ever ran a mile, you thought you were going to die.
Right.
Right. And then you recently ran what was your last run you did?
Well, I've done a couple half marathon. Well, I've done one half marathon this year. That was like my farthest, but yeah.
Yeah. Imagine feeling that same way. However it was, however old you were the first time you ran a mile.
Yeah.
I think my first mile time was over 10 minutes, right?
Yeah.
And I thought I was going to drop dead, and other people in the gym class were puking, right?
Yeah. So literally, some people out here if you listen this long, you must be somewhat interested in books. But if you just started trying to get in the habit of reading or whatever, it is a muscle. You get, you're used to looking at screens, you're used to looking at scrolling, and your brain just skips across the surface of you're not used to like pausing and thinking about the words on a paper, but that is a muscle. Yeah. So it is like running that first mile. You think you're going to die, your heart's going to explode, and you're huffing and puffing and panting, and you had to stay in bed for the whole day because you ran a whole mile. Where after a while, you run a mile and you're not warmed up yet. It's not far enough to get warmed up. So it's the same way with reading. But immersive reading, try that, folks out there. You can get a lot of books on YouTube. I have an Audible account. I know Brad's got an Audible account. And just be careful on how many times you return your audiobooks when you're done with them, because they will kick you into, they'll put you on probation.
They'll put you in jail, yeah.
Put you in jail, and you can't return them for a while. But that's a great thing to do. And then I want to challenge people too. A lot of times, now, one of the smartest guys that I know, our smartest friends is Jim Alter, just a really sharp guy. And he will say this about fundamentalism, that fundamentalism is an anti-intellectual movement. And really it was a responsive action to the liberalism that was in seminaries and in universities.
And I'm sorry, I will add that it was based on the fact that regardless of what they're saying, we know they're already wrong. That was exactly where the fundamentalists started. Whatever they're saying, they're wrong.
Yeah. Now, in the initial movement too, like if you look at the fundamentalists, and there's a multi-millionaire who sent over 100,000 copies of these volumes. I don't own a copy of those volumes, defending the faith. And so there was a counter movement. But some of this anti-intellectualism was actually like, I'm not going to read. And, if you read, you're going to be in trouble.
Yep.
Or a lot of, for instance, I know a lot of people who like follow Peter Ruckman.
Sure.
But they don't follow him in his reading.
Right.
When he was at Bob Jones University, he read over 5,000 volumes when he was there. They wanted to hire him as a professor. He read his whole life, and he read literature. I remember hearing him preach one time on all this, and he started quoting from All Is Calm on the Western Front, mother, he starts quoting this big long dialogue, and he had read that piece of literature and he could quote it.
Right.
And so I'm saying, here's one of your heroes. You know how he was able to debate all these liberals and say, so-and-so said this and they're an idiot, and so-and-so said that and they're a moron. Sure. It's because he actually read so-and-so.
Right.
And he could quote what they quoted, and then he could have his debate comeback. Another person that people point to is D.L. Moody.
Right.
D.L. Moody, didn't even have a high school education. He butchered the King's English. But if you read anything about Moody, he was a vivacious Bible studier and reader. And then also he had a huge library. And I have a book over here. It's 1,001 quotes from D.L. Moody from my library, 1,001. And he probably has 500 references to different books from his library.
Yeah.
And so he was a well-read man. You can't say, well, I don't read like D.L. Moody. Like, no, sorry. And there's the old quote, and this is so true. The difference between the people that you look up to and the people that you don't look up to is the people that you look up to read. So not all readers are leaders, but all leaders are readers.
Yeah.
And really, if you think about somebody who is a influencer, like a big influencer, you mark it down. That person is a reader.
Yeah. Otherwise, they're not worth listening to because they don't have anything to say.
Yeah. And it's old Charles Haddon Spurgeon. He who never reads will never be read. He who never quotes will never be quoted. And he who fails to use the brains of others prove that he has no brains. And, there's some, I hear these guys that are like all into preaching and they're scared of books. Well, yeah. Preaching is just, a guy getting up there and expound what they're supposed to expound upon what the word of God is saying. Mm-hmm. A lot of times it's just people flapping their gums.
Yeah.
Where a book is actually someone who put a lot of thought, insight, outlined, edited their thoughts down into paper.
Right.
And so ultimately a good book reading a good book is going to be far better than reading a sermon. Mm-hmm. I believe in preaching.
Sure.
I am one.
You are one.
So I better believe in it. But yeah, reading a book, I mean, how is that different than listening to a sermon, a good one or a bad one? There's good sermons, there's bad sermons, there's good books, there's bad books.
Yeah.
One last thing I was going to mention is that I would suggest that you write down the books that you read. And one of the things that I do is I put a rating next to the book. So it's either 5 stars or nothing. Okay? This is the way I do it.
Just like Amazon.
Yeah, it's either 5 stars or 0 stars. So 9 Marks of a Healthy Church, 5 stars this year. Good Grief, that was a 5-star book. Tale of Three Kings, that was a 5-star book. I'm up to 14 books, and I should finish 3 this week.
Nice.
If I'm on track. So I recommend, like C.S. Lewis, he said that he hardly had time to read a new book because he was so busy reading the books he'd already read.
Oh, yeah.
So the best reading is rereading a lot of times. Yeah. But I can go back to 2022 and look at my list of books and look at my 5-star book. So I can always go back, and a book that I really thought, man, this would be worth reading again, I will mark that again. And I really think it's important to try to get the best quality book that you can.
Right.
And so I try to be careful in buying books that they're like recommended or, somehow they're going to be, especially at this point with the books that I have, my eyes are bigger than my stomach. I have more books than I'll read before I die. So anyway.
Well, see, that's the thing. You just got to learn how to read faster.
Yeah, I do. Jim Quick, I get his advertisements on my feed.
Oh, yeah?
It's all about quick reading.
Oh, yeah.
His name's Jim Quick. Man, that was convenient.
There was an NHL goalie. His name was Jonathan Quick.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he could move quickly.
Yeah, yes. Yeah. I wonder how fast he could read. Hey, anything to add before we shut her down?
No, I mean, like I said, just reading is a muscle.
Yeah.
And all good muscles need development over time, right?
Yeah.
And listen, it's okay to be wrong, and it's okay to change your mind. It shouldn't be happening all the time, right? But all truth is God's truth.
Amen. Hey, thanks for being on, Brother Brad.
All right, thank you for having me.
And then, if you made it all the way to this point, I want to reward you with something. First, I'll say 5 people to email me at. I already gave Brad this book, so I'm not going to give you another one. pastorthoughtsmail@gmail.com. I ordered, I don't even remember doing it, but about 10 copies, but I'm going to give away 5 on this episode. 10 copies of A Tale of Three Kings. It was recommended by your old pastor, Bruce Craig.
Yeah.
I read it. It was phenomenal.
Yep.
And I've given several copies away to people, and the people who have read it said it's phenomenal.
I liked it.
But if you send me an email, now you have to have your address in there, unfortunately, or else I can't get it to you. But I will mail out a 5 listeners. I'll mail you A Tale of Three Kings. And God bless everybody. And stay tuned. We got some exciting episodes coming up. Thank you so much for watching or listening to the Pastoral Thoughts podcast. We'd love to hear from you. Please reach out to us at pastorthoughtsmail@gmail.com. Also, if you want to check out more about our ministry here, you can visit pastorjack.org. I do have a blog that I do write. I'd love to have you as one of my subscribers there. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and share. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for listening. God bless you.